The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's ESSA webinar. We appreciate your joining us today. Before we start the program, I'll just go over a few housekeeping items. We know there's going to be a lot of questions on this topic, and we're going to leave time at the end of the presentation for Q&A. We'll get through as many questions as we can, and if we're not able to get to your question, we will do a follow-up email and information on the website, so you'll be sure to get your questions answered. Go ahead and send in questions as they come up for you, and we'll put them in the queue to be answered at the end. To send a question, simply click on the Questions tab in your control panel, type your question into the top box, and click on the Send button. If you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, please use that same question feature to get my attention, and I'll do my best to resolve the problem for you. We will be providing you with a recording of the webinar and a copy of the PowerPoint slides, so keep an eye on your inbox for a link to those later today or tomorrow. You'll also be able to find them on the Agile website, which is agile-ed.com. Now let's get started. I'm pleased to introduce today's speakers, Steve Rowley and Jenny House. Steve is CEO and founder of Acumen Partners. He is a high-performing professional with extensive experience in business management, organizational turnaround and revitalization, new market penetration, and strategic product lifecycle management. Steve is an expert in getting companies to drive results with a consistent focus on 4 key principles: consistent organizational vision, customer-centric market approach, continual improvement of operational practices, and an intense focus on product excellence. Steve always proactively meets challenges by empowering proven individuals and building competent teams. Steve is joined today by Jenny House, who is founder, president, and principal of Red Rock Reports. She provides her clients with strategic vision from both business and education perspectives. Her deep knowledge of the K-12 market comes from years of experience in district administration as well as industry management. At Red Rock Reports, Jenny focuses on the impact of funding knowledge on sales, advising clients about federal and state funding trends and execution strategies, and aligning funding sources to client products and programs. Her prior experience includes teaching and administration positions in the public sector and holding management positions in the private sector at Hewlett-Packard and Apple Computer, as well as executive positions at Classroom Connect and 10th Planet. We're thrilled to have Steve and Jenny with us today. As I said, we've got a lot of information to cover on ESSA, so I'm going to hand the program over to them now.
Great. Thank you, Emily. I want to thank everyone for coming today. ESSA is a topic that definitely impacts every vendor as well as every school in the United States, the U.S. K-12 market right now. And we're going to take a time today to explore what the changes are in this new law that impact most particularly our ability as companies, as suppliers to schools, in our basic or core value proposition. Some of the changes in this legislation actually can render product either irrelevant or of lower value, certainly reprioritizes the way in which schools will be viewing their money, where they'll be making decisions and spending their money for the next 18 to 36 months. So as we talk today, we're going to be really combining 2 areas of specialty. One of those is the strategic vision and crafting and putting forth your value proposition. And the second is going to be the combination of that strategy with funding changes. So we're collapsing 2 very difficult topics into one session. We've got more material than we can squeeze in, so I'm going to encourage each of you to follow up with Agile and make sure that you get the notes from today's session. We're also going to be making 2 handouts available to all participants, one of those being a tool to help you test your value proposition in the current legislative environment, and the second being greater detail in each of the funding mechanisms that we'll be talking about today. So as we proceed forward here, I am having just a little bit of an issue with my screen. Hold on one second as we try to get this to proceed. We may have to proceed this way. Hopefully the screen is still visible. All right, so we're going to start today by discussing the impact that ESSA will have on every U.S. segment, the segment of the K-12 industry. this reauthorization, one of the questions that we get commonly, and I'm sure, Jenny, that you have received the same question multiple times, is why is this reauthorization of the federal legislation such a big deal? What's different about the shift 12 years ago into No Child Left Behind and what's happening today with ESSA? They're very different pictures. And the big deal this time with ESSA is, unlike No Child Left Behind, this new legislation makes a dramatic shift in actual accountability at the federal, state, and local levels. So there's a new threshold for accountability. It also makes major changes in the role that data plays in that accountability model and in reporting of results back to the state and federal levels. There are major changes in how that reporting mechanism is going to be taking place, who's going to be counted, how they're going to be tested, and then how funds are going to be distributed back to the school districts. And for all of us, how we receive our money, how our schools get their money, them to spend with us, is a very big deal. And there are fundamental assumptions made about the role of technology within the school districts themselves. So we add those all together, the accountability changes at every level, the role that data plays, much greater role than it has previously, the mechanisms for funding, how money is going to get from the federal and state governments, particularly the money that they have choice in where they're going to spend it, and the role that technology is going to play in delivering a greater or an enhanced learning experience for the students. All those fundamental assumptions are changed with the reauthorization of the Eisenhower grant, and currently named ESSA. So as we talk value proposition, I want to make sure that we are clear that we're not talking about how we frame our message to our existing market. That's important, and commonly that's referred to as our value proposition. We're actually talking about the core value proposition of your company and the core value proposition of your product. Those of you who are familiar with the popular business canvas right now and the value proposition canvas will recognize this picture. It places the fundamental elements that drive consumer choice on the right hand of this picture. They're basically driven by the pains that a consumer experiences and the elements of your product that offer them gains. What are they looking for? So as we look at who we're selling to, whether it's district administrators or principals, the nature of the elements that are causing them the most difficulty, that's changing. ESSA has created new pain points, and particularly through its implementation phase, ESSA is going to make those very painful because there's not enough money in many cases to go around to cover these new pain points. And what is being rewarded has also shifted. So previous focus on accountability for teachers, for how schools were held accountable for performance, those equations have changed at the fundamental level. So that changes what's going to be valued by a school district. So as we look back at the company, at your organization or our organization, we have to match our product and ask, is this still viable? Is the problem that we solve for educators still a priority for them? And if it's not, what do we need to do to either revitalize our product so we're back in the running for the choice, or how do we make a change that keeps us strategic in the marketplace? We need to make sure all of us are front of mind for our consumers, maintain our position in their spending patterns, and let's take advantage of the change that's going on and expand our footprint. We will be making available to those of you who are interested after this presentation a worksheet that helps you walk through your value proposition in light of ESSA and identify areas of possible disruption and areas where you would have relative strength against the rest of the market. Those are unique to each of your companies. Some of these changes will favor you, and some of these changes will be a disadvantage. So it's important you get that value proposition straight as quickly as possible. One of the things that's a hallmark of ESSA right now is it is changing perceptions literally at every level of education. How the federal government is budgeting and allocating money is being adapted now. And instead of working directly with school districts and state education agencies, the federal government is going to be transferring accountability as well as funds to the state level and moving themselves out of the funding and the accountability picture significantly. We'll get into that more a little bit later here, but the role of the federal government and the Department of Education has been taken, let's say, 2 large steps backward from direct visibility of accountability. And again, we'll get into the role of the federal government, but this is a major change at where pain points are being created. One of the things that we've been very comfortable with as an industry, especially with No Child Left Behind, is we knew where the accountability was, and we could look at it as a national picture. We knew that Tennessee and California had very similar pain points. Going forward, we will not be able to use the federal law to identify those specific pain points, or only at the most cursory level. We'll have to be looking at every state to identify where the actual pain points are on a state-by-state basis. So accountability, and that's going to the second light green step here, accountability is being shifted to the states. States are designing their own accountability programs that will be used to track both their progress and the progress of all of the school districts, schools, and students within their state boundaries. So it sounds like the federal government is giving the money, telling the states, build your own accountability plan, we'll tell you if it works or not, and then you hold yourselves accountable for spending the money that we're giving you. We're giving the inmates the keys, is how the model kind of works here, and there's a lot of truth to that statement. As we step further down now, districts are also being empowered with the new law to play a role in their own accountability. So districts are working collaboratively with the states in determining both their spending plans and in determining how they're going to be accountable for results. Every state will be designing and developing their own unique accountability plan, and districts will be holding themselves accountable along with state partnerships. So this is a significant change in the way accountability has been viewed in the U.S. education market. And then, of course, at the lowest level, the most granular level of our market, teachers and students, there is no longer a highly qualified requirement for teacher progress. That has been eliminated. So there is no federal mandate that directly attaches the performance of students with the performance of teachers. Teachers are no longer required at the federal level for discretionary spending purposes to meet a certain professional development requirement each year. Again, this is a big change. And so as school districts are deciding how to spend their Title I, their Title II, their Title III, and their Title IV monies, professional development now has a very different priority than it did, 6 months ago, up until December of this year. We've put together a little conversation here that identifies how this transition is taking place. The federal government is still in charge of allocating the funds. So they still must go through the process of building the federal budget. They still must go through the process of getting that through Congress and getting that approved. Those funds are attached to federal strings. The biggest difference is that the states are being told, give us a plan of how you plan to spend the money, put together your own strategic accountability plan, tell us how you're going to spend the money. We will approve it through a peer approval process. So there will be a peer review process for every state accountability plan. And then, based on the quality of the state plan, the federal government will be allocating or appropriating the money that will be sent. So if it sounds like I promise you money, if you put together a plan that I like, that's what's going to happen. So the federal government requires states to create their own spending plan. That gets approved through peer review process at the federal level, and then the states will receive money based on a number of factors, including the merit of that plan, from the federal government to spend each year. And Jenny's going to cover in greater detail how this funding mechanism works and how it actually will impact the way that organizations school districts in particular, but also other educational entities are looking at the money they're receiving and then are choosing to spend it. Jenny, if you would just tell me when you need to switch slides, we'll transition over right now over to a current funding snapshot. And just to prep you with Jenny's comments, this is a quickly changing picture. So just in the time that we've put together the last set of slides, changes have come into effect through recent meetings that forced us to go back into the slides and make last-minute changes. So ESSA changes as they go through this regulatory process are occurring almost on a daily and certainly on a weekly basis. So this is just a snapshot of what the funding looks like today. And as we go through the next several weeks and the next few months, this picture will change. Each change will now become more granular or smaller on its impact, but it is subject to change. Jenny, do you want to take it from here?
Certainly. Thank you, Steve. The reason I call it the latest funding snapshot is, to me, if I were still in charge of instruction in a school district, this new law is cast in jello. That means there are so many things that still are to be determined. So let's go over the implementation timeline, what you can expect, because we really are heading into a transition year. So if you think of it, looking at this model right here, December, they passed ESSA, everybody's, okay, let's go, let's really get, get going. When does the money start coming? When do changes start happening? Well, remember, this is the federal government. It moves a little slower than we do, so it's getting public input. That happened. They held meetings around the country. Then they go back. The U.S. Department of Education revises, and then they've been having rule-making negotiation meetings. And some of the things were, okay, assessments. Steve was talking about the states choosing their own assessments. Well, the role of the federal government, and they actually said this in a meeting last Friday, is called light guidance. Don't you love that one? I've raised 6 children. I think it was a little more than light guidance. But the federal government is, making the rules or doing drafts and getting rulemaking. So in assessment, what are the tools that the states are going to use? So they really are giving some light guidance in terms of features that have to be there, because they don't want states using any crazy assessment tool that's out there. They want it research-based, they want it validated, et cetera, et cetera. So they pretty much ironed out what they wanted for assessment. The big rulemaking part that has not gone well is in Title I, supplement versus supplant. And that is, can the school district use the Title I money now that the states are making the decisions about how the money is going to be spent? Can they use it to pay personnel? Can they use it for things that before they've paid for with state and local funds? And there's a lot of discussion about that. It would seem pretty obvious to you in this audience, but it is not. So we're still waiting on that one. So again, they're going back to the drawing board. I've just looked at a new draft that's out there. So it just doesn't happen quickly. And remember, there's still this interesting body called Congress that still has to review this and approve, because they're the ones that are going to appropriate the money. So we really want them. So what's happening now is, again, they've had the public comment. They're revising the drafts. They're still, coming up with the final rules, because the states can't make their plans till they really have the final, light guidance from the federal government. So that's going to continue through August and September. Supposedly, The rules are going to be made by the federal government by October, but they're leaving this gap time that if Congress really has some problems with it, and Senator Lamar Alexander is very clear that the federal government is to have this light guidance role. If they, are too heavy-handed, it goes back to a congressional committee. So we really are going to see some negotiations at that level as well. So at the latest, it would be December. But the states have already started their meetings. I know Colorado's been the State Department has been going around to a lot of the districts. Here are, the basic tenets of ESSA. How would you as a school district deal with this? What role, how can we be supportive, et cetera. So this, once all the states are going to be doing this, and full implementation really doesn't start until August of 2017. So this transition year is a big planning year. For your information, the funding during this time, everybody thought that we're going to get this new funding starting August 16. Au contraire, it's going to be pretty much the flat funding of what we had last year. And one of the items that will be in the document that Steve referred to that will be available after this is what those numbers were last year, so you can remember of all the federal programs, because that's going to be pretty much what we have through 2016-17. There are going to be a couple of changes, and I'll talk about them coming up. So next slide, Steve.
And I think as we're changing slides here, it's important to point out, Jenny, that the schools will be having to facilitate the changes on the same budget. There's no new money allocated to transition from NCLB to ESSA, and so all this change is being funded on last year's budget. That makes less discretionary money for all of us to compete for.
But it's, there's a lot of confusion out in the schools right now. They really don't understand when this all happens. So, there's going to be the crazy buying time right now, May and June, because people really want to make sure they don't lose money in this transition. And so, there's good news in terms of the buying, although some districts will say, wait a minute, we're going to keep it all because we don't know what's going to happen. So you might run into either of the scenarios. So just, some of the things. It's about Title IV, Part A. This is a brand new fund that's going to be available called Student Support and Academic Enrichment. I wonder where the federal government gets these names. This is a big one that's going to be really important for you as vendors in terms of what is going to be available to buy your products. It's about I attend webinars from DC, probably 3 a week these days, and some meetings say it's 1.65 billion, other 1.7 billion. It's not actually new money. It was 49 small programs that were collapsed and put into this big fund. So it's consolidated. And it really increases the purchasing power because it's a lot of flexibility. Remember, it's up to the states how they want to spend the money, and they're working with the districts in terms of how they want to spend the money. So it's a lot of flexibility, and it's, as one of the webinars talked about, it's really a holistic view of teaching and learning. How do you know in Chicago what the rural schools in Montana need? So it shouldn't be the same in terms of, how the money needs to be spent. So the good news is there will be increased purchasing power with this, and I'll talk more about this later and the specific categories. It's also formula driven. Just like NCLB, most of the federal money that's coming through ESSA is based on the Title I formula. And really that's the role of the government, to make sure that the disadvantaged have access to the same instruction, the same materials, the same learning to prepare them for college and careers. So, you know, that is pretty much the same. There's an interesting thing when we talk about the formula, and this you really need to understand. Title 4A, if we got the full amount of money, every district gets a minimum of $10,000 just for Title IV Part A. If they get more than $30,000, based on, you know, the Title I numbers, right? If they get more than $30,000, they must have a needs assessment to say how the money should be spent in 3 categories. One is well-rounded education, and I'll get into that a little bit more. That's a, you know, nice bucket of money. 2 is safe and healthy programs. To really, you know, if you think about all the violence that's been in the schools, this money is spent on bullying programs, you know, just a lot of safety in the schools. So if you sell products in that category, that's, you know, great for you. But the biggest amount of money is called effective uses of technology. And I'll get into that one a little bit more. But as I said, if it's over $30,000, a needs assessment must be conducted to say how the well-rounded education money will be spent, how the safe and healthy programs money will be spent, and how the technology money will be spent. So that's really important for you to know as you go into a district that has over $30,000, because you want to know what are their goals in those 3 buckets and how does your product align. If it's less than $30,000, the good news is they can spend it. Of course, you know, it's not a lot of money, but they can spend it any way they want. They can combine all of those, except for 15% of the technology money can be used for infrastructure, but only 15%. And I'll get into that a little bit more of what that means for technology infrastructure. So that big thing for you to remember is that $30,000. Next, Steve. So, well-rounded. So this one, if you think of, it's everything. Remember, 49 programs were condensed into one. So well-rounded, it's well-rounded learning experience, STEM, arts, music, obviously reading, math, you know, it's a social studies, everything is in that well-rounded. So if you're a content provider, this is a great one for you. It doesn't have to be digital, it can be print, it can be manipulatives, but that's that well-rounded bucket. And they really do want to see a holistic view that we're not just drill and kill in math and reading, okay? Let's look on the right-hand side. That's that safety and health, the development of the whole learner, drug and violence prevention, bullying, harassment prevention, athletics, you know, for health, positive behavior support, counseling, etc. So if you have products and services in that, that's a great bucket that's dedicated to that. And sometimes, you know, you'll see that there's a little bit of everything in your product. But that big bucket is that effective uses of technology. 15% can be used for infrastructure, which is your equipment, so tablets, PCs, as well as, you know, routers, etc., to use for the infrastructure. So, and I'll get into a gotcha on that 15% on a next slide. But this is a great one. Now, think about it. If you've got a digital product, you can also use professional development for teachers in this one, as well as for the students. So your product may be digital, it may, so think of commingling the funds for your product. So it may be, as you think about these different buckets, how your product can fit into them. That's very important. So next slide, Steve. So I kind of go a good news, bad news scenario. You gotta, and remember, this is a snapshot as of today at this time of day, knowing that by the end of the day, I may be wrong, and so it's all changing. So $1.7 billion, isn't that wonderful? We just saw how much is going to be available. Wonderful, wonderful. Well, the president's budget for that FY17 is only $500 million. So as it is, if we got the 1.7 billion, it's going to be allocated by formula. If we only get 500 million, the states are going to have competitions for the money. And only a few districts are going to be able to do this. So the good news is, and the bad news is, maybe things will change, but as of today, that's what we want. The good news about ESSA is it had bipartisan support. Patty Murray from the Democratic side, Senator Lamar Alexander, they gathered, each of the parties to get the support for this. There was a lot more to it, but those two got it done. But Congress must approve the appropriations. Well, we all know Congress hasn't been spot on in terms of supporting a lot of the education initiatives. So, what's going to happen, we don't know. And then there's the outlier, this election that we all are watching with, carefully and shaking our heads. So, those are, the real wild cards that are going to influence this. That formula for 10K to 30K for the districts, this is, a really important one. Of course, if we don't get that money, it'll be the competitive grant if there's the big shortfall that I talked about. So next slide, Steve. So more good news, bad news. Let's talk about that 15% for technology infrastructure. The big goal is improving the technology infrastructure so that every student, no matter what school, no matter what geography, that they have the necessary hardware and connectivity. That does include, this 15% includes, the one-time acquisition, and that's what it says right now. This was as of a meeting in Washington last Friday. One-time acquisition of PCs, tablets, and the equipment, okay? So it's not that full 960 million, because I can see, I used to work at Apple and HP, I can see, boy, they can buy, all that money used for technology. Au contraire, it's that 15%, okay? Increased district purchasing power. Yes, that's the great one. But what we're worried about is this is so flexible that it's going to be all over the map in terms of how people are using the money. Well, Congress really likes to see, the results of what their money is being spent for, because they have to go back to their constituency and say, hey, I voted on this money, and look at the difference that it's making on students. If it's so dispersed, that's a danger, that's a risk, so we don't know. SIG, school improvement money. A lot of you have been making a lot of money on the SIG schools, that extra $500,000 to $2 million to improve the schools for 3 to 4 years. Well, guess what? That is going away. That was federal money specifically for that program. And as Steve said earlier, now that's up to the states to identify the schools that are going to need that intervention, and they've got to decide where that money's coming from. So as of last week, I called the Department of Education to say, so when specifically does the SIG money end? If you're already in the process of your 3 years, do you still get the money? That is not clear. 1 week I got the answer of yes, the money's going to be there to continue the program. As of Thursday last week, that was not as clear. It doesn't mean for sure it's going away, but I'm just raising the red flag that these are the kinds of things, when I said this is cast in jello, these are the kinds of things we're not sure. The definite thing is in 2017, there is no SIG program. It is a state-based school intervention program. Next one, Steve. So the states get 5% of Title IV-A to monitor and manage this program. Well, I don't know about you. I'm in California, and the state departments over the course of NCLB have really been stripped. The personnel to run programs has really been reduced. Well, I'm really worried about their ability to, one is they've got to make these plans, two is they have to monitor the implementation of it, and three is they have to report on it. Well, only 1% of that 5% can be used for administration, which includes personnel. So that's just a red flag of its own, is worrying about, the state's abilities. And boy, a lot of them have already raised their hand and saying, hey, Washington, we need help. If you are, chucking this over the fence to us, we need more help. So it's just, that call has been, really put out there. The last thing about the technology infrastructure money is there is a huge cry from government, actually a rule. This one is not light guidance, this is heavy guidance. Whatever the money is being spent on from E-rate of a school district, the same thing cannot be paid for by the infrastructure money. Okay? Very important that you know that they are saying, everything that E-rate is paying for stays in the E-rate bucket. Those things like connectivity, the services, the phone services, the connectivity services, that cannot be paid for out of this infrastructure money. So, you've never really had to monitor. Some of you have never had to monitor E-rate. Some of you live by E-rate. But, that's an area that's got to be black and white as opposed to gray. So it's important that you notice this at the same time. I think, just in closing my part, if I were still sitting in your shoes, the thing that I would really be cognizant of is you really have to know, as we start to see the plans coming out, you've got to know what these different state plans are, because they are determining what their standards are, they are determining their assessments, they are determining their accountability, and they are determining what their priorities are, as are the districts. So if I had my tier 1 states, I'd want to know what their plans are. I would want to know what the top districts' plans are. So, that's what we are living this day by day and waiting for this to come out. Oh, I do have one last thing. Any moment now, and Steve and I wake up each morning and the first thing we do is we look for this. There are going to be 7 pilot states that are going to be piloting, especially the assessment and accountability, starting in September. But They haven't been announced yet. I've seen several states throw in their hat to be considered for this, but we don't know who they are. As soon as those are announced, and we will make sure that you know who these are, you need to look at your implementations in those states and make sure they're happy, because whatever they're doing may be scaled and replicated by other states. If you don't have an implementation in those states, I sure as heck will get in there and do as much as I could. So I'm turning this back to you, Steve.
Thank you, Jenny. You've done a great job, Jenny, of giving us kind of a smattering of this Title IV funds. This Title IV funding change is one piece of the puzzle of change that's associated with ESSA. One of the things to remember with funding is that several of the funds that we talk about commonly that relate to education, such as E-rate, IDEA, special needs, Head Start, or early childhood, these are funding mechanisms that address education but are not governed by the Eisenhower monies. They're not part of ESSA. So lest we think that the federal government has given now all the money for education to the states, this is not the case. They have given title monies in the direct allocations to the states, but they maintain control of three other major funding mechanisms that usually work in construct with the title monies. So there is a very large political game being played right now where we are heralding the shift of control from the federal government with all this magnanimous money, and they're giving it to the states, and states are coming up with their plans, and it's billions of dollars. All the strings are not going to the states. There are still very strong federal controls on E-rate, and they're controlling some of this through the supplanting rule that Jenny mentioned. There are still full federal control over the IDEA funds, and the mechanism between IDEA and ESSA has not been specified in the rulemaking process to date, and the federal government is still keeping complete control of the Head Start program, though again, it is being dispensed in conjunction with ESSA. So yes, we're seeing a major shift in power to the states. How that's going to play out with other funding sources that school districts use in conjunction with it, we don't know yet. That's part of what's going to be happening over the next couple of months. Some of the major things that are happening in ESSA that will be impacting our actual ability to sell to school districts, the value proposition, our core, the core of our business, is the shift in evidence of effectiveness. We had this great windfall, guys, when No Child Left Behind came in and they called for evidence-based programs, and we all ran out. Some of us did pilot studies that were good scientific research, very rigorous. Many of us grabbed research that was sort of aligned to our products, or we used somebody else's research, or we gathered stuff that was done in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, tied it to it, and magically we qualified as evidence-based products. So all companies had their own strategy to demonstrate how we are meeting an academic rigor in the design and the impact of our product. The evidence of effectiveness, the core of how we sell to schools, is being changed, and this is not up for discussion. The I3 grant has now been established that the rules of rigor that were used to construct I3 are now being applied universally across the title monies. So the Title IV, Title I, II, III, in order for schools to purchase, this idea of evidence of effectiveness is no longer anecdotal. We can't go forward with a bunch of teachers' comments that said, I love this program, I couldn't teach children without it. That's not going to work anymore. So we're looking at a much higher level of university or research, nonprofit research rigor that's involved in demonstrating the impact of our product. There are 4 different levels in that model, and our products will be evaluated based on the framework established by individual states. So if you're reading into my comments that there could be 50 different levels of effectiveness that we have to measure our products by, that is true. The 7 states that Jenny mentioned earlier as the 7 pilot states will be our first litmus test as vendors or suppliers to tell us this is how states are most likely to address evidence of effectiveness. But we know it can't be less restrictive than the I-3 grants. So this is a major pain point. If you do not have rigorous research around the effectiveness of your product, you have a period of several months to begin putting together your scientific plan, your lowest tier, and then showing how over the next year to 24 months you are going to be hitting higher levels of rigor in your demonstrated impact. So if you want money, discretionary federal money going to the states to be spent with your product, on your product, you have to come up with an effective model of evidence that you can then demonstrate to both the states and the school districts. And there is not a consensus yet as to what that means. The new ESSA calls out the requirement for each state to adopt challenging standards. Great word, challenging standards. They are careful not to identify Common Core. That doesn't mean they're encouraging that people step away from Common Core. A lot of the things Common Core has been blamed for have nothing to do with the standards. The federal government in ESSA is prohibited from becoming too closely attached to anything that's related to those standards. There is a hard line that's been drawn there. Assessment and training, or assessment and testing, the rigor again has been raised on the assessment and testing. While there's more freedom of choice for individual states, the federal government is still now more rigorous on what will be acceptable. Each state is going to be putting together individual accountability plans. These are sweeping accountability plans for students, districts, and schools, and they will be used to determine who qualifies for or must receive guidance in turnaround or intervention. Again, we mentioned earlier the significant role of data that is going to be part of our lives going forward. The capacity to do the research and the disaggregation and aggregation of data that schools will have to do, most of that doesn't exist today. It has to be created over the next 12 to 18 months. If we want to look at individual products and measure how big this has shifted, teacher effectiveness, a major example of change. No more highly qualified. If you believe that this is less restrictive because there's no longer a definition, that only means there's going to be 50 definitions of what it means. So while we take away the words highly qualified and there was one definition nationwide as to what that meant, now there will be 50. School interventions, the schools that actually qualify for additional funds, look at the word SIG, the schools that qualify for additional funds for school improvement now will be driven by a different set of standards. And those will be governed by the state accountability plans and by the way the schools and the states are collaborating. So this mechanism for school and districts and states to communicate on the data of their performance becomes critical. It's one of those implicit changes according to the law that aren't specifically spelled out. Special education has changed significantly. The way subgroups are being measured, they can no longer exclude. The rules for who gets to be excluded from major testing and as allowed exceptions, that has been limited now to just 1%. Not a huge change from before. The language around it is significant. ELL demonstrates a major shift. Accountability for students of second language is being shifted from Title III to Title I. So the same accountability measures now go across all Title I qualifying schools and students. That is significant. The other significant part of this is that within the Title III program, students now will be adopted or brought into an ELL program and be categorized as ELL after 1 year in the country, no exceptions. And they must exit an ELL program at the end of their 3rd year, no exceptions. That's the way the rules read right now. So again, a major shift. If you're ELL, you can read that they're going to be using money to move progress very quickly in a concentrated way. There's opportunity. Early childhood, once again, we're seeing this combination of multiple funding pots coming together, state control and federal control over different funding pots. We don't know how that's going to work yet, but it's going to be dramatic. So, you know, the real question is, what does all this mean to your value proposition? when you look at next year, as you look at the 2016-2017 school year, there is no increase in funding. If you have been marketing to the same basic need or selling to the same basic need for more than 3 or 4 years, you are in a different boat now. So you need to look at where the money for your product is going to be coming in. Where do you map in this federal and state funding source? How are schools going to be able to spend money? You're going to have to teach them some of this because they're going to be in the dark as well. And you're going to need to look at your business and identify, here's how we're going to receive the money. Here are the pain points that are associated with them with the new law, and measure the gaps between where you're at and what's going to be required. One of the things that you can be sure of is these are unfunded mandates at this time. While the funding is being shifted, nobody is paying for the change. The federal government has not increased the flow of money to accommodate the alterations that are being required at the hands of the districts and the states. So if you are and can position your products in some way as part of a change agent or able to simplify this process of change, or that you are going to make their lives easier, that's a position you couldn't have used 12 months ago, but will become very important over the next 18. Once you've mapped the gaps that are critical, that your product matches, you can't do them all at once as a company. So understanding how you need to prioritize those in light of what's happening in the market is going to be essential for your profitability. When there's a lot of chaos like this, and while new rules are being written, where school districts are having to make their plans, not even knowing what the accountability is going to be for next year, and they won't know until they've already rolled those out, it leaves a lot of uncertainty. And uncertainty can lead to uncertainty in terms of spending. We've seen what may turn out to be a record-breaking spend down this year, and the numbers are still out on that. It appears to be. We might see a remarkably conservative fall season. So if you've had a great profitable spring, you need to understand that the changes haven't begun yet. They now start rolling more aggressively into the schools, and we may see a significant shift to a much more conservative stance while schools wait for the final rules to come out. And once you've prioritized those gaps, you have to execute. Where do you go from here? How do you approach this problem? You essentially have 90 days. From today to the beginning of the fall spending season, which we time at August 15th, you're down around 87 days to get yourself ready for that fall season and to be executing going forward. So that means a rapid analysis of what is your value proposition, how are you going to position and talk to schools, what do you need to do to your product to be relevant to today's funding. Has the legislation changed the money, and if so, how much does that impact your company? You've got some time to analyze it, but not a lot. As Jenny mentioned earlier, these 7 states, get your target states identified. Where does most of your money come now? Where are those states leaning in terms of their legislative process? The spring sessions are either wrapping up or are moving quickly that direction right now. You will be able to look at the states within the next few weeks and see what they've put on the plate and executed for this year and what they've already moved off for the fall sessions. Get information on your target states so you understand the direction they're heading, and then get prepared for this transition. This isn't speculation. This is not a group of individuals that are saying this is going to be a rough year. This is already in motion, and ESSA is no longer being debated. It has been executed. And so these are certainties. We'll do our best, myself and Jenny and our teams, we'll do our best to keep the flow of information coming out. We are scheduling a part 3 of this series to bring people up to date in September, working with Agile to get this out to the community, to let you know where things will be standing by mid-September after the school year has started. But there is a definite countdown for the next 90 days to be ready for that fall season. We don't see a recurrence or a resurgence in spending behavior or things becoming normal before the end of the 2016-2017 funded school year. So this debate is not going to be short, and it's not going to be solved by October of this year. So what you're starting now is important, but it's going to be an 18-month sprint just to stay in here and stay relevant. I know we wanted to have some time for questions. We ran a little bit long here. I appreciate everybody sticking with us. I want to make sure that you know that we've got the 2 handouts available to help you map the changes and what the impact is going to be on you. The one is a value proposition tool that helps organizations look at ESSA and helps you say, this is the pain points we addressed earlier. These are the new ones. How do we accommodate that? So we've got a tool to help you work with that. And then we've got a detailed handout that specifies where these funding sources, especially Title IV, are going to be focused. So you can start mapping to the intended money, how it's been budgeted so far. Can't speak to allocation. And Emily, let's go ahead and turn the time back to you for any questions that we still have time for.
Can I, Emily, just one sec. One tip, Steve, that we got Friday was if you're a brand new company, one of the things you were talking about, evidence of efficacy, that's pretty tough to do if it's a product that is brand new to the market. What they do want to see is a very thorough paper or some proof of the research that your product was based on. This is not for old companies or products that have been in the market for a long time. It is just for new products. So don't think that you can't sell because you don't have some longitudinal study. But you do have to have the proof of the research that your product is based on.
That's correct. Yep.
Thanks for clarifying that, Jenny. And we do have some questions that have come in. We're not going to be able to get to them all, so I just want to let everybody know that if we don't get to your question, we will share those with Jenny and Steve, and we'll do a follow-up with folks so that you get your questions answered. One of the major questions that we've gotten is where folks can get those handouts that you've referred to. So you can contact Ellen, whose information is on the screen, and she'll hook you up with those handouts. We'll also put that information in the email that we'll send out later today or tomorrow that includes the link to this slide deck that you've seen as well as the recording of the webinar. But Ellen is the one that you need to reach out to get those handouts. All right, so we'll take a couple questions, and then, like I said, we'll turn these over to Steve and Jenny to handle offline. So first one, Jenny, and this is probably for you, but can you give a real brief and high level, what are some of the major programs that were collapsed to form the new Title IV? So what are some of the programs that we're missing now?
Good question. Actually, they're small programs like the Civics and Literacy, or Civics and History, Physical Education. There were, some small programs like that. Not, any of the main programs that were brought in. It was really very, very small ones that had to do with some small safety programs that are wrapped into the Safe and Healthy Schools Students program. So I can get a list of it specifically, but off the top of my head, those are the 3 that came up right away. But that's only 3 of 49, so I can get a list and I will include that.
Yeah, and I think one rule of thumb for those funds is that they represent a significant portion of them represent funds that remained unspent at school districts because they couldn't find a way to fit it to a product very easily. So a lot of them were rural funds. They were funds that were so specialized. They were pork barrel funds that had a hard time getting spent. So a lot of it was being unspent and turned back. So in a way, they are new monies that have been allocated appropriately. And a lot of them were funds that never actually got allocated. They were budgeted but never received the funding. So we'll see what happens with them.
Okay, that's good clarification as well. So in terms of products being deemed effective, how does this impact technology in particular? How is effectiveness going to be determined for a technology product versus a core curriculum?
The measure of effectiveness is not going to change whether you're looking at a technology product or you're looking at a curriculum product. So we're going to be mapping everything against its ability to help raise the performance of the school in which it is present. So if you are a hardware vendor, and you are working to show that you are improving the performance within a school, you will need to look at the academic requirements, where the school sits, and you'll be looking at what role your piece of hardware will be playing. You will have the opportunity to define, in large measure, how you're going to contribute. That doesn't mean that you have to map it to, one-to-one to an improvement in math while you're a server a provider or an appliance provider, but it does mean that you'll need to be able to identify when schools use ours, we have greater uptime. Here's a longitudinal study that indicates, in this environment we performed at this level, and here was our frequency, and this is how it contributed to student learning. You're going to have to chain those things together to tie it to the performance of the school in one way or another. The actual details are going to be coming out individually by state, and will be tied into that accountability plan, but you'll be held to the same standards as everybody else if you hope to receive this money.
Okay, and we'll take just one last question, and this is kind of a big one, but where can folks find information about what states are doing in terms of their accountability plans?
I'll take that one, Steve.
Sure.
The states themselves will be publishing these, not the federal government. And right now, there are no state plans because the state plans have to follow the federal guidelines, which are still not finished. So, but these meetings, like I talked about in Colorado, they do know they're going to have an accountability plan. They do know they're going to have assessment plans. So what they're doing is meeting with their districts because they're really collaborating. And then they'll come up with some drafts, but they really won't be published until they know what the federal guidelines are and how they are meeting those guidelines.
Yeah, and the hard part is there is no central repository or clearinghouse for this information. So quite literally, it is a targeted search of state websites, and there may be organizations that step forward and help aggregate those plans and draw the correlations. I wouldn't expect that to occur, in the first 12 months. There's just too much change, and so nobody stepped forward to be a clearinghouse for those plans. So for the next 12 months, it is picking your target states, watching those SEA websites, and then making sure that as soon as it becomes available, you're grabbing that plan.
Great. And so I just want to reiterate, because this is all very complicated and changing quickly, that both Acumen and Red Rock reports are staying on top of this. As Jenny said, she's on those webinars. They're waking up in the morning figuring out what's going on. So reach out to Ellen at Acumen, and she's happy to help your company strategize around this and create that value proposition that is so important to moving forward. And certainly Agile, in partnership with Acumen and Red Rocks, is going to continue to provide these webinars and articles and keep you as up to date as possible. One question that did come in is, and Steve, this is for you, is the webinar that you did in January, is that information still valid? And if people want to watch it, if it is valid, that is posted on the Agile website, which is agile-ed.com. And if you go to the resources tab, you'll find a webinar tab and can access that webinar that Steve did in January.
And the data is still accurate and relevant. The changes that are being announced are holding pretty true to the predictions that were made back in January, February. So we're seeing the timelines move. It's just as rough. We're seeing the spending patterns follow about what it was expected to follow. The point of divergence that we're really concerned about actually is coming up. As we see the end of this 2015 school year and moving into 16-17, that's where we would expect to see, if there's going to be movement in those projections, it's going to happen here in the next 90 days. So we're watching carefully. Jenny and I are communicated very frequently, probably more than we like, but we're talking to each other often about what's happened, what did you see, where is this going to impact, and we're trying to stay on top of that. So yes, it is. It's still available on Agile's website. This should add to that information. So part 2 should add to part 1 and add detail to it. So if you missed part 1, go get that. And then you can be watching for part 3, where we will tell you how that transition occurred and what the trajectory is after this summer, which is really an important period of time.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for hanging on. And that webinar that Steve has referenced, the third part of this ESSA update, is going to be on September 15th, and we will get out registration information to you, as well as information about our webinars coming up in June, July, and August as well. So a very big thank you to Jenny and Steve for putting in all the time and effort to put this information together and share it with us. It's definitely been helpful. So thanks everybody, and again, keep an eye on your inbox for the link to the recording and the slides, and we'll also include Ellen's contact information in there so you can reach out to her to get those handouts that are referenced throughout the presentation. Thanks everybody, and have a great afternoon.